I've led the October trips 3 years running now, and I can tell you the ridge above Tallulah Gorge in the fall is as close to reliable as backcountry work gets. The Marietta group, Cole Santos and his 2 sons, Sage and Thomas, plus Sage's college friend Hayden, made decent time up the 441 corridor. Nobody complaining, nobody lagging behind to photograph every goddamn leaf. We reached the campsite 2 hours before dark with the temperature already dropping into the low 40s, which meant I could get the fire going before anyone started asking about it. Cole was the kind of client who wanted to help set up camp because he thought that was part of the experience. I let him clear rocks from the tent pad, kept him busy. Sage and Thomas had that easy back and forth you get with brothers who've done this before, dividing tasks without discussing them. Hayden mostly stayed out of the way, which I appreciated. The fire caught clean on the second match. By the time the light started to fail, we had 4 tents in a loose semicircle around the fire and everyone's gear sorted. I was crouched by the ring, feeding in a split log, when I heard boots on dry leaves behind me. Not loud, not trying to be quiet, just someone walking at their own pace. I looked up. The man coming out of the tree line was maybe 50, loose-limbed, wearing a canvas jacket and carrying a steel thermos in one hand. He had the kind of face that made strangers comfortable. Easy smile, nothing sharp about him. "Heard voices," he said. "Thought I'd check in. Brian Ross." I stood. "Louis Sullivan. This is Cole, Sage, Thomas, Hayden." Brian nodded to each of them like he already knew their names. "Y'all picked a good spot. Gets cold up here this time of year, but the view in the morning makes it worth it." Cole asked if he was camped nearby. Brian said he was, a little higher up the ridge, close enough to the trail that he'd heard us making camp. He settled onto one of the logs we'd dragged in without being invited, unscrewed the thermos, and poured himself something that steamed in the firelight. Nobody questioned it. That's the thing about Brian. He had a way of making his presence feel like it had always been part of the plan. I'd seen him before, not just once. 3 times in the past 2 years, always along the 441 corridor, always at a different campsite, always arriving the same way. Out of the tree line at dusk, thermos in hand, settling in beside someone else's fire. The first time, I'd thought he was local. The second time, I'd started wondering why a local would be camping this high in October with that much frequency. The third time, tonight, I noticed his breath wasn't fogging in the cold. Sage asked if he hiked the area often. Brian said he knew the ridge well enough to walk it without light, which got a polite laugh, because it sounded like the kind of thing people say. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and started talking about the terrain. Not a ghost story. He didn't frame it that way. He described the ridge the way you'd describe a sinkhole or a box canyon, a feature of the landscape you learned to account for. "Something old lives up here," he said. "The Cherokee named it, gave it wide berth. It's been taking people off these trails longer than anyone's kept records." Thomas glanced at me. I kept my face neutral. Brian kept going. "No body left behind," he said. "Just an absence. What remained was always dry. Boots upright, laces tied, leather untouched. Sleeping bags empty, but zipped shut. The fog that did the taking never left moisture on what it passed through, as though water itself was the first thing claimed." He described it as a shape that came in low fog, the kind that pooled against the ground and moved in ways that didn't match the wind. It didn't kill the way animals killed, he said. It absorbed. Took warmth first, then weight. By morning, there was nothing left. No blood, no bone, No indication anyone had stood in that spot. Cole was grinning. Sage looked entertained. Hayden was listening, but not reacting much. I watched Brian's face in the firelight and tried to figure out what he wanted. I had a retriever once, Brian said. Good dog, followed me everywhere. We were up near Wildcat Creek one evening, just above the tree line, and she got ahead of me. There was a low bank of fog sitting in a draw, maybe 30 feet across. She walked into it, didn't come out the other side. He paused, took a sip from the thermos. The fog sat still for a moment after she went in. Then it drifted uphill. I felt his eyes on me when he said it. Not on the group. On me. The grin didn't shift. That's a good one, Sage said. Seriously, where'd you hear that? Didn't hear it, Brian said. Saw it. Cole laughed. Called it the best campfire story he'd heard since Boy Scouts. I laughed too, because that's what you do in front of clients when someone tells a story that's supposed to be entertaining. I was aware while I did it that the laugh was a performance, and I was aware that Brian's grin stayed exactly the same when I produced it. He stayed another 20 minutes, talked about weather patterns, trail conditions, the usual. Then he stood, screwed the lid back onto the thermos, and said he'd let us get some sleep. He walked back into the tree line the same way he'd come, boots crunching on dry leaves until the sound faded. Sage banked the fire. Cole and the others turned in. I sat by the coals for a while, not because I needed to, but because I didn't want to lie down yet. The cold was settling in hard, the kind that gets into your shoulders and stays there. I kept thinking about the retriever, about the fog drifting uphill. Around midnight, I heard it. Not a sound. A silence. The woods went quiet in a way that didn't feel like nighttime settling. I looked up from the coals. Fog was rolling in from the high timber above the camp. Not from the gorge below, where the thermal gradient would pull it. From above, moving downhill, thick enough that I lost sight of the tree line 10 feet out. Cold in a way that October on the ridge doesn't account for. I stood, put my hand out. The fog touched my palm and I pulled back without meaning to. It was wet, and it was moving. Hayden said he was walking to the tree line to take a piss. Nobody said anything. He stood, zipped his jacket, and moved toward the edge of camp. I watched him go. The fog was thick enough that he disappeared into it after 10 feet. But I could still hear him. Boots on dirt, the shift of undergrowth, the small sounds a person makes when they're moving through timber in the dark. Then there was nothing. No cry, no snap of brush, no sound of a fall or a stumble or someone turning back. Just the wind in the upper timber and the low creak of the fire. I sat there listening, waiting for the footsteps to come back. They didn't. I gave it a minute, maybe 2, long enough that I started thinking about how long it takes a man to relieve himself in the woods, and long enough to know that Hayden had been gone past that. The forest was making every sound it had been making before he left. Birds settling, wind through the high branches, the occasional crack of a limb cooling in the cold. But the silence where his footsteps should have been was the only thing that felt wrong. I stood and picked up the flashlight. Sage looked up from the fire. Everything okay? Yeah, I said. Just checking. I walked toward the tree line, sweeping the beam low across the ground. The fog sat heavy over everything, cold and wet enough that I could feel it on my face. I moved slowly, tracking the direction Hayden had gone, scanning the dirt and the undergrowth for boot prints or broken branches, or anything that would tell me where he'd walked. I found his boots. They were standing upright in the dirt at the edge of camp, maybe 15 feet from the fire. Laces still tied. The leather was dry. I crouched down and put my hand near one of them without touching it. The fog was sitting wet over every surface in camp. The tents, the packs, the stones around the fire. But the boots were bone dry. I looked at the dirt around them. No gouge marks. No flattened undergrowth. No sign of a drag or a fall. The ground looked like someone had set the boots there on purpose and walked away. I stood and swept the flashlight across the timber. Nothing. No movement. No sound from anywhere in the trees. The fog sat around the boots without moving. I went back to the fire. Cole was standing now, arms crossed, watching me. Sage and Thomas were still sitting, but their postures had shifted. They knew something was wrong. "We need to get down the trail," I said. "Right now." Cole frowned. "What's going on? What kind of emergency?" "The kind where we don't stay here," I said. "Get your gear. We're moving." "Where's Hayden?" Sage asked. "I don't know," I said. "That's why we're leaving." Cole took a step toward me. "I'm not moving until somebody tells me what happened." I put a hand on his shoulder. Not hard. Just enough weight to make it clear this wasn't a conversation. "Keep walking," I said. "This isn't a debate." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded and turned toward his tent. The others followed. Nobody asked again. It took them 5 minutes to break down the tents and get their packs on. I kept the flashlight on and kept watching the tree line. The fog hadn't moved. The boots were still there, upright in the dirt, dry. I didn't go back to look at them. We got onto the trail. I took the lead, keeping the beam low and steady on the dirt ahead of us. The fog was thicker now, sitting heavy enough that I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The group stayed close behind me. Nobody spoke. The trail curved down through a stand of oak and pine, narrow enough that we had to walk single file. I heard Cole breathing hard behind me, heard the shuffle of boots on loose stone, heard the creak of pack straps adjusting under weight. Normal sounds, the kind you hear on any night hike. I kept the flashlight moving, sweeping the trail ahead, watching for roots and rocks and anything that would trip someone in the dark. Then the beam found him. Brian Ross was standing on the trail ahead of us, no thermos, hands at his sides, the same easy grin on his face, blocking the route down. I kept the flashlight on his face. Brian stood in the middle of the trail, hands loose at his sides, the grin steady and easy like he'd just come around the bend and was happy to see us. "Heard you breaking camp," he said. "Thought I'd help get you down safe." Behind me, Cole was still breathing hard from the hike out. I could hear Sage shifting his pack straps. Thomas hadn't said anything since we'd left the fire. The fog sat heavy around all of us, thick enough that the beam didn't reach more than 8 or 10 feet before it disappeared into white. "Trail gets tricky in the dark," Brian said. "I know it well enough to walk it without light. I can lead you out." For 1 second, maybe less, I felt the pull of it. The familiar face, the reasonable offer, the voice that sounded like it belonged to someone who had done this before and knew what he was doing. I felt the specific relief of not having to make the next decision alone, and I almost let him do it. Then I kept the light on his face and watched him speak. Every word came out clear and unhurried, the same warm baritone he'd used at the fire, the kind of voice that makes strangers feel like neighbors. No breath vapor, nothing. Cole was standing 3 feet to my left, panting hard enough that I could see the clouds rolling off him in the cold. Sage and Thomas were the same. Ragged white plumes every time they exhaled, loud enough that I could hear the air moving in their chests. The temperature was in the low 40s. Everyone standing on that trail was breathing visible proof that their body was alive and warm and working. Brian wasn't. I kept the flashlight steady on his mouth. The words kept coming. No fog, no vapor, no biological evidence that a living thing was producing them. I thought about the story he'd told at the fire. The retriever, the way he described it. Not like a man recounting something he'd heard from someone else. Not like a campfire tale passed down through enough voices that the details had gone soft. But like a man describing something he had watched happen from close enough to see the dog's eyes before it walked into the fog. The precision of it, the lack of hedging, the grin that hadn't shifted when I laughed, because he'd been watching me to see if I would. He hadn't been a bystander. "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said. I kept my voice low, quiet, the kind of tone you use when you're stating a fact and closing the subject, not opening a negotiation. Brian's grin didn't shift into something else. It didn't twist or harden or flatten into anger. It just emptied. The shape of it stayed exactly where it had been, but everything behind it pulled back, and what was left wasn't recognizable as an expression a person would make. It was the grin with nothing underneath it, a mask sitting on a surface that didn't move. The fog around his feet started pulling toward him, not drifting, pulling, slow coils, deliberate, like it was being drawn in by something I couldn't see. "Sage," I said. "Thomas. Run." I didn't look back to see if they moved. I kept the light on Brian's face. "Cole," I said. "Go. Now." I heard them move. Boots on dirt, pack straps creaking, the sound of bodies running downhill through the dark. I stayed where I was, flashlight steady, watching Brian's face stay exactly where it had been, the grin still empty, the fog still coiling toward him like it was waiting for permission. He took one step forward. I swung the flashlight across his face as hard as I could. The lens cracked. The beam flickered and died. I felt the impact travel up my arm, felt the plastic casing give under the force, and I didn't wait to see if it had done anything. I turned and ran. The trail was narrow and uneven, and I couldn't see more than 3 feet ahead of me in the fog. I kept one hand out in front of my face to keep from running into a tree, kept my boots moving, didn't slow down when I felt roots catch under my heel or rocks shift loose under my weight. I heard my own breathing, loud and ragged, heard my pack slapping against my back with every stride. I didn't hear anything behind me. No footsteps, no sound of pursuit, just the wind in the upper timber and my own breath and the trail dropping away under my boots. The fog thinned as I dropped elevation. 10 feet of visibility became 20, then 30. The trees opened up. The trail widened. I kept running. The trail gave way to the parking area, where Sage and Thomas were already standing with a phone out, calling the Robin County Sheriff's Office, and I ran into the light. The deputies arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 vehicles, lights running, radios clipped to their belts. Sage and Thomas were still standing by the trailhead when the trucks pulled in. Cole was sitting on the tailgate of his rental, jacket pulled tight around his shoulders. I was standing near the group, the flashlight still in my hand. The lens cracked, but the weight of it somehow steadying. The first deputy out was a woman in her early 40s, compact build, blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. She came over with a notebook already open and asked who had called it in. Sage raised his hand. She asked me if I was the guide. I said I was. She asked what happened. I told her one member of the party was missing on the ridge. Hayden Espinoza, 28 years old. Last seen around midnight walking toward the tree line at the edge of camp. I said there was fog, heavy fog, and that he hadn't come back. I said I'd gone looking for him and hadn't found him, and that we'd decided to get the rest of the group off the trail. She asked if there had been any indication of injury or distress before he went missing. I said no. She asked if he'd said anything about leaving the group. I said he'd told us he was walking to the tree line to relieve himself. That was the last anyone heard from him. She asked if there had been anyone else on the trail. I paused. Not long, just long enough to feel the question settle. I said there had been a man at the campfire earlier in the evening, Brian Ross. He'd come out of the tree line around dusk, introduced himself, sat down by the fire. I said he'd told the group a story about the ridge, and that after Hayden went missing, Brian had been waiting on the trail when we tried to descend. I said he'd blocked the route down and made it clear he didn't want us leaving. She asked if Brian had threatened us directly. I said yes. She asked what he'd said. I told her he'd offered to lead us down and that when I refused, he'd stepped toward me. I said I'd struck him with the flashlight and run. The rest of the group had made it down ahead of me. She wrote that down. Then she asked me to walk her through it again. I did. Same sequence of events, same names, same timeline. But the second time through, I left out the part about Hayden's boots, the ones I'd found standing upright in the dirt, laces still tied, leather dry. I told her I'd found nothing at the tree line, no sign of Hayden, no indication of where he'd gone. She noticed the shift. I saw it in the way her pen stopped moving for half a second before she continued writing. She didn't call me on it. She just noted it. The second deputy, a younger man with a square jaw and a Rabun County Sheriff's Office jacket 2 sizes too big for him, asked Cole if he could confirm the timeline. Cole said he could. He said we'd been at camp, Hayden had walked off, and I'd told the group to get moving. He said Brian had been on the trail and that I'd told them to run. He said they'd run. The younger deputy asked if Cole had seen me strike Brian with the flashlight. Cole said no. He'd already been down the trail by then. The deputy asked Sage and Thomas the same question. They both said no. The first deputy asked me again about what I'd found at the tree line. I told her I hadn't found anything. No tracks. No sign of Hayden. Just fog. She asked if I was sure. I said I was. She made another note. I knew what that note was. It was the record of me changing my story. It would sit in a file somewhere. A small inconsistency between the first telling and the second. The kind of thing that gets flagged during follow-up interviews or depositions or whatever comes after a person doesn't come back from a camping trip in a national forest. I accepted that. The first deputy asked if I knew where Brian Ross lived or worked. I said I'd seen him around the 441 corridor before, and that I thought he worked part-time at Henson's Bait, a shop about 6 miles south of the trailhead. She asked if I knew his full name. I said Brian Ross was all I had. She radioed it in. I heard the dispatcher repeat the name back. Heard her say she'd run it and see what came up. The younger deputy asked if there was anything else I wanted to add. I thought about the way Brian's breath hadn't clouded in the cold. I thought about the grin that had emptied into nothing when I told him I wasn't going with him. I thought about the fog pulling toward his feet in slow, deliberate coils, like it was being drawn back into something that had released it in the first place. I said no. Nothing else. The first deputy closed her notebook and told the group that search and rescue would be on the ridge by first light. She said they'd need to take full statements from everyone in the morning, and that we should plan to stay in the area for at least another day. She asked if we had a place to stay. Cole said they had a rental cabin in Clayton. She said that was fine. She gave Cole her card and told him to call if anyone remembered anything else. She asked me if I was staying in the area. I said I had a place in Tallulah Falls. She gave me a card too. The deputies stayed for another 10 minutes, documenting the vehicles in the lot, taking down plate numbers, making sure everyone was accounted for. Sage, Thomas, and Cole were present. Hayden Espinoza was not. That was the scope of it. One person missing. One person of interest named. The rest of us standing in a parking area under portable lights, the ridge above us invisible in the dark. The deputies left around 3 a.m. Cole, Sage, and Thomas got into the rental and drove south toward Clayton. I stood by my truck for a while, the cracked flashlight still in my hand. The weight of it, somehow the only thing keeping me from walking back up the trail to see if the boots were still there. I didn't go back. I got in the truck and sat with the engine off, watching the tree line at the edge of the parking area. The fog had thinned at this elevation, but it was still there, low and dense between the trees, moving in ways that didn't match the wind. I started the engine. The dashboard lit up, the fuel gauge needle ticking past half, the clock reading 3:47 a.m., the check engine light that had been on for 3 months still glowing orange. I put my hands on the wheel and they were shaking. Not a lot, just enough that I had to grip tighter to keep them steady. I looked at the tree line one more time. The fog was still moving wrong, still pulling inward towards something I couldn't see. I put the truck in gear and pulled out onto 441, heading south toward Tallulah Falls. The road was empty, no headlights behind me, no taillights ahead, just the center line unwinding in my high beams and the ridge falling away in the rearview mirror. I kept checking the mirror. I don't know what I thought I'd see. Brian standing in the road behind me, maybe, or the fog spilling down onto the asphalt. But there was nothing, just dark trees and empty road. I made it about 2 miles before I had to pull over. I stopped on the shoulder, engine still running, hazards on. My hands were shaking harder now. I gripped the wheel and tried to breathe through it. I thought about Hayden's boots again, the way the laces had still been tied, the way the leather had been dry even though the ground around them had been damp with fog. I thought about the way I'd crouched down next to them, close enough to see the tread pattern on the soles, close enough to reach out and touch them if I'd wanted to. I hadn't wanted to. I'd stood up and backed away and told myself I'd come back for them later, bring the deputies up to see them, let them document it properly. I hadn't gone back. I sat there on the shoulder for maybe 10 minutes, watching the fog drift across the road in thin bands. It was moving downhill now, the way fog is supposed to move. Normal, predictable. I told myself that was a good sign. I told myself the thing on the ridge was staying on the ridge. I didn't believe it. I pulled back onto 400. I waited until morning. Then I got in the truck and drove back to 441. Henson's Bait sat a quarter-mile off the highway, low cinder block building with a hand-painted sign and a gravel lot that always had 3 or 4 vehicles parked out front. Locals, mostly. People who fished the Tallulah or the Chattooga and needed gear they could count on. I pulled in around 8:30 and sat in the truck for a minute, watching the front door. The shop was open. I could see movement through the window. Someone behind the counter. Someone else browsing the wall of tackle. Normal morning business. I got out and walked inside. The bell over the door rang when I pushed through. The guy behind the counter looked up. older, maybe 60, wearing a Henson's cap and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. Not Brian. I'd been in here twice before, both times when Brian was working, and I'd seen this guy then too. Owner or manager. I didn't know his name. He nodded at me. I nodded back. Then I walked down the center aisle like I was looking for something, letting my eyes move over the shelves without really seeing them. Lures, line, hooks, weights, the smell of rubber waiters and old coffee, a radio on low behind the counter, playing classic rock. I stopped at the end of the aisle and looked back toward the counter. The guy was ringing someone up. I waited until the customer left, then walked over. "Help you with something?" he said. "Looking for Brian Ross," I said. "He working today?" The guy shook his head. "Nope, haven't seen him in a few days." I kept my face neutral. "He call in?" "Didn't call, didn't show." The guy shrugged. "Happens sometimes. Brian's not what you'd call reliable." I nodded like that made sense. "You know where I could find him?" "Couldn't tell you. Brian keeps to himself." I thanked him and walked out. Got back in the truck and sat there with the engine off, looking at the shop through the windshield. The bell rang again. Someone else going in. Business as usual. Brian wasn't there. That was the first answer. The second answer was that nobody at Henson's seemed particularly bothered by it. I started the truck and drove back to the cabin, spent the rest of the day doing nothing. Watched the tree line, checked my phone twice. No calls. The next morning I went back. Same gravel lot, same vehicles parked out front. Different configuration, but same type. Work trucks, a sedan with a dented bumper, a Jeep with mud on the tires. I parked in the same spot I'd used the day before and walked inside. Same guy behind the counter. He looked up when the bell rang, and I saw the flicker of recognition cross his face before he smoothed it out. "Back again," he said. Not a question. "Yeah," I said. "Brian show up yet?" "Nope." I waited for him to add something. He didn't. Just stood there with his hands on the counter, looking at me like I was a customer who'd overstayed his welcome. "You file a report?" I said. "For what?" "Missing employee." The guy's expression didn't change. "Brian's not missing. He's just not here. There's a difference." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic, not anger. Just the slow recognition that I was asking questions I already knew the answers to. "Right," I said. "Thanks." I turned and walked out before he could say anything else. I sat in the truck with the door open, one boot on the gravel, and stared at the shop. The bell rang again. Someone came out carrying a plastic bag, got into the Jeep, and drove off. Brian Ross had worked at Henson's Bait. That was a fact. He'd been at the Ridge campfire 3 nights ago. That was a fact too. And now he wasn't at Henson's, and nobody at Henson's was asking where he'd gone. And that was the third fact. I thought about the boots at the tree line. Hayden's boots, standing upright in the dirt, laces tied, leather dry. No body, no blood, no sign of a struggle, just an absence where a person used to be. And I thought about Brian's face when the grin left it. The way it hadn't shifted into another expression, but had just emptied, like someone turning off a light in a room you didn't know was occupied. The Rabun County Sheriff's Office had Brian's name and his employer. I'd given them that in my third statement, the one I'd revised down to something they could use. They could follow up if they wanted to. They could come to Henson's and ask the same questions I'd just asked and get the same answers. I didn't think they would. I pulled the door shut and started the engine, put the truck in reverse and backed out of the lot, then turned onto the access road that fed back to 441. The shop disappeared behind me. I merged onto the highway heading south and kept my eyes on the road ahead. I didn't look at the ridgeline in the rearview mirror. I knew it was there. I knew the campsite was up there somewhere, above the gorge. And I knew the tree line where Hayden's boots had been was still standing in the same configuration it had been standing in for 1,000 years before I'd ever set foot on it. But I didn't look back. I drove south on 441 with both hands on the wheel, past the turnoff for the Tallulah Gorge overlook, past the ranger station, past the stretch of timber that ran unbroken for miles on either side of the highway. I didn't look at any of it. I just drove. I kept taking groups out. Same trails out of Dillard I'd been running for 6 years before the October group. Same permit zones, same staging points, same loop routes that brought clients back to their cars before dark. I just stopped going above a certain elevation, and I stopped allowing fires on the ridge. Nobody asked why. When someone looked at the map and pointed to the upper section, the stretch that ran parallel to the gorge rim, the campsites marked in green above the 3,800-foot line, I told them it was a permit issue, trail condition, liability matter. I picked whichever version matched the person asking and delivered it with the same flat tone I used when I told them how to pack a bare canister, or which bootlacing pattern would keep their heels from blistering on the descent. The explanation landed as information, not evasion, just the parameters of the trip they'd signed up for, and they accepted it, because I didn't deliver it like it was up for debate. I delivered it like I was telling them the truck held 5 passengers, or the trailhead opened at 7, or we weren't bringing glass containers into the backcountry. A fact. A condition of the service. Something I knew and they didn't, which was the entire reason they'd hired me in the first place. I recognized the pattern. I'd been doing this for 6 years before Hayden Espinoza walked into the fog at the tree line. 6 years of clients asking questions I answered and questions I let die on the trail. The difference now was that the list of questions I wouldn't answer had 2 new entries, and I'd gotten better at making sure those questions never got asked in the first place. I didn't think about it as lying. I thought about it as route selection. You didn't take a group up a trail you knew was washed out. You didn't camp in a drainage zone during storm season. You didn't walk clients past a section of ridge where something had taken a man's boots off his feet without leaving a mark in the dirt. Same principle, different variable. The rules I'd made weren't protection. I understood that. The thing on the ridge, whatever Brian had been part of, whatever he'd become indistinguishable from, it hadn't followed me down to the parking area. It hadn't appeared on the lower trails. It stayed where it had always stayed, in the fog and the cold and the upper timber, in the places the Cherokee had named and avoided long before anyone filed a permit or marked a campsite on a Forest Service map. But I couldn't explain that to a client from Marietta who wanted to know why we weren't hitting the scenic overlook they'd seen on the website. I couldn't say. A man walked into the fog up there and left his boots behind. And another man who wasn't breathing told me a story that turned out to be true, and I hit him with a flashlight and ran. That wasn't a sentence I could say out loud and remain a credible guide. So I didn't say it. I said, permit issue, trail closure, erosion risk on the upper section. We'll stay below the gorge and get you a better view from the south face. And they said, okay, because that was the agreement. They didn't know the terrain. I did. They asked questions about distance and difficulty and whether we'd see wildlife, and I answered those. The other questions, the ones about why I looked at the ridgeline the way I looked at it, or why I started packing up camp the second the fog came in wrong, or why I never let a fire burn past dusk anymore, those questions didn't get asked, and if they did, they got answered with something else. I didn't call it evasion, I called it doing the job. The job was getting people onto the trail and off the trail and home safe. The job was not explaining every variable that went into the route selection. The job was knowing which risks were acceptable and which ones weren't, and keeping the clients on the acceptable side of that line without making them think about the line at all. I was good at it. I'd been good at it before the October group, and I was still good at it after. The only difference was that now the line was lower, 3,800 feet. Below that, I operated the same way I always had. Above that, I told people no, and I didn't explain why, and nobody pushed. Nobody except Cole Santos, once, about 4 months later. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. I was in the truck, parked outside the Ingalls in Clayton, going through the week's schedule on my phone. The number wasn't saved, but the area code was Atlanta. I almost didn't answer. Then I thought, client inquiry, and picked up. Louis Sullivan. Louis, it's Cole Santos. I didn't say anything right away. My hand tightened on the phone without me deciding to tighten it. I could see the Ingalls entrance through the windshield. A woman pushing a cart toward the automatic doors, a kid trailing behind her. And I kept my eyes on them because I didn't want to look at anything else. Cole, I said. My voice came out level. I didn't know how I'd manage that. Yeah. Listen, I wanted to ask you something. He sounded the same as he had on the trail. Steady, reasonable, the guy who'd kept walking when I'd told him to keep walking. I'm planning a trip for this spring, wondering if you're running groups up to the ridge overlook. I looked down at my lap. My left hand was resting on my knee, and I watched my thumb press into the denim once, then stop. I didn't remember deciding to do that either. I'm not, I said. Silence on the other end. Not long, maybe 3 seconds, but I heard it. How come? He asked. The woman with the cart had gone inside. The kid was still standing by the entrance, looking at something on the ground. A bug, maybe, or a coin. Permit restrictions, I said. Upper section's been pulled for the season. Another pause, shorter this time. Okay, Cole said. Thanks anyway. He hung up. I sat there with the phone still against my ear for a few seconds after the line went dead. Then I lowered it and set it on the passenger seat. My hand was steadier now. The kid by the Ingalls entrance had gone inside. I didn't think Cole had believed me. I thought he'd called because he wanted to hear what I'd say, and now he'd heard it. And that was the end of the conversation. I didn't think he'd call again. I kept the cracked flashlight in the truck. I didn't replace it. I didn't throw it out. I just left it in the storage bin behind the driver's seat, under the tow straps and the first aid kit. And every time I opened that bin, I saw it and didn't think about it. That was the arrangement I'd made. With myself. With the terrain. With the clients who hired me to show them the mountains and trusted me to bring them back. I showed them the mountains. I brought them back. I just didn't take them above the line. It was April when I led a group down through the lower timber, a family from Asheville, parents and 2 teenagers who'd wanted a moderate day hike with some elevation gain, but nothing technical. I'd taken them up the South Loop, kept them below 3,500 feet, and turned them around at the overlook that faced away from the gorge. They'd gotten their photos. They'd seen the canopy and the ridges rolling south into the blue distance. They were happy. We were descending single file, the trail wide enough that I didn't need to call out obstacles. The father in the lead and the kids behind him, and the mother at the back. I was second, just behind the father, keeping an easy pace. The light was good, the air was warm, the trail was dry. Above us, somewhere past the canopy, the ridge sat in its old cold silence. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes on the trail, on the clients ahead of me, on the section of ground I needed to cover before we hit the trailhead. The father asked if we'd be back this way in the fall. I told him probably. He said his kids had loved it. I said I was glad to hear it. We kept walking. The trail curved left. I found the footprints on a Tuesday morning in the late April, when the ground was still soft from overnight rain and the upper trailhead smelled like wet pine and cold mud. Small prints, child-sized, maybe a 7-year-old, maybe younger. The tread pattern was clear enough that I could make out the individual ridges. Running shoe, something cheap, the kind parents buy at Walmart when their kid outgrows a pair every 4 months. I crouched down and followed them with my eyes. They started at the edge of the gravel parking area, where the trail surface transitioned from stone to dirt, moved in a straight line toward the tree line, 20 feet, maybe 25, then stopped. Just stopped. No prints coming back. No scuff marks where a kid had turned around. No indication they'd kept going into the undergrowth on the other side. I stayed down. The cold came up through my knees from the mud, settling into my joints the way it had the night of the October group. The same quality of cold, the kind that didn't match the air temperature or the season or anything the weather report had promised when I'd checked it that morning. I looked at the tree line. The fog sat just past it, low and thick, the kind that pooled against the ground instead of drifting. It hadn't been there when I'd pulled into the parking area 15 minutes earlier. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on the prints. A child's voice called from inside the fog. "Mr. Sullivan." Not a shout, not scared, just my name, clear and even, like a kid calling across a playground to get a teacher's attention. I didn't move toward it. The voice knew my name, not hey or mister or help. My actual name, first and last. The thing on the ridge had information it shouldn't have, and it was using it the way Brian had used his grin at the campfire, as an invitation, as something meant to make me comfortable enough to step forward. I stayed where I was. The voice came again. "Mr. Sullivan." Closer this time, maybe 10 feet inside the fog. It had moved toward me without crossing the tree line, without making a sound in the undergrowth, without producing the crunch of leaves or the snap of a twig or any of the noise a body makes when it walks through a forest. I held my position on the trail. My hands were at my sides. My boots were planted in the mud 6 feet back from where the footprint stopped. I was not going to step forward. I was not going to answer. I was not going to give it anything that made the invitation easier to deliver. The fog shifted, not drifting, pulling. The same movement Brian had described the night he told the story about the retriever. The fog sitting still after the dog entered, then moving uphill, away from the point of contact, taking something with it. It pulled back from the tree line now, slow and deliberate, withdrawing into the timber above the trail. The cold went with it. The air warmed by 5 degrees in the span of 10 seconds, and I felt the shift in my chest before I registered it on my skin. The forest went quiet, not the temporary quiet of an animal going still, the deep quiet, the kind that meant everything with breath and weight had already moved out of range, because they knew what was up there, and I was the only one still standing in its shadow. I looked at the footprints again. They were still there, clear and sharp in the mud, ending at the tree line with no return path. A child had walked into the fog, or something had made it look like a child had walked into the fog, and either way, the result was the same. I didn't report it. I had clients waiting at the lower trailhead, a family from Asheville, 2 kids, both under 12. I'd left them at the parking area with instructions to stay near the car while I checked the upper trail for washouts. That was the reason I'd given. The real reason was that I didn't take clients above 3,800 feet anymore, and I needed to make sure the section I was willing to walk them through was clear. I walked back down the trail without telling them what I'd found. Because what was I going to say? That there were footprints at the tree line that didn't come back? That something in the fog had called my name? That the elevation boundary I'd been enforcing for 2 seasons, the one I told clients was about permits or trail conditions or liability, had just failed, and the thing Brian had described with such precision and such care was already working its way down toward the places I still took people? I couldn't say that. So I didn't. I kept walking. The trail dropped through a stand of white pine and came out at the lower parking area, where the family was waiting by their sedan. The father looked up when I came into view. The kids were sitting on the bumper, swinging their legs. The mother was checking her phone. "We good?" The father called. "Yeah," I said. "Trail's clear." That was the truth. The section I was going to walk them through was clear. The section above it, the section where the footprint stopped and the voice had called my name. I wasn't taking them anywhere near that. The father nodded. The kids hopped off the bumper. The mother put her phone away. They followed me onto the trail, and I led them down through the Gorge corridor, the way I'd done 100 times before, pointing out the overlook and the waterfall and the place where the ridge dropped away into nothing. I should have told them. Looking back, that was the moment. But I didn't. I walked them through the Gorge corridor with my mouth shut and my eyes on the trail ahead, and the whole time I could feel the weight of what I wasn't saying sitting in my chest like a stone. The daughter asked about the fog. She was maybe 9, wearing a purple jacket too big for her, and she pointed up toward the tree line where the white was just starting to show through the canopy. "Is that normal?" I looked where she was pointing. The fog was lower than it had been that morning. Not by much, maybe 50 feet, but it was there, pooling in the timber above us, and it hadn't been there when I'd walked this section 2 days ago. "Yeah," I said. "It's normal." Her mother glanced up, then back at me. "It's pretty thick." "Happens this time of year," I said. "Warm air off the gorge, cold air from the ridge. They meet in the middle, and you get fog." That was the script, the same thing I'd been telling clients for 2 seasons. Thermal inversion, weather patterns, normal conditions. I'd said it so many times, I almost believed it myself. The mother nodded. The daughter kept looking at the fog for another few seconds, then turned and kept walking. I stayed where I was, watching the white shift against the trees, and my hands were shaking when I shoved them into my jacket pockets. The father had stopped ahead. He was looking back at me. "You coming?" I pulled my hands out of my pockets and started walking. We made it to the overlook 20 minutes later. The kids stood at the railing and looked down into the gorge. The mother took pictures. The father asked about the geology, and I gave him the same answer I always gave. Erosion, Sediment, the river carving through rock over millions of years. He nodded like it made sense. The kids got bored and started back toward the trail. I looked up at the ridge. The fog was still there, thicker now, low enough that I could see the edge of it through the canopy, maybe 200 feet above where we were standing. It hadn't been that low when we'd started. It was coming down, not fast, but steady. And I was standing there with 4 people who didn't know what it meant, telling them about erosion and sediment and acting like the white creeping through the trees was just weather. The father touched my shoulder. I flinched before I could stop myself. "You okay?" he said. I looked at him. He was maybe 40, wearing a fleece vest and hiking boots that still had the tags on the soles. His hand was